So this week we have Carlos Santana. Carlos grew up here in Utah. He went to BYU and got a BA in philosophy, the linguistics minor in 2010. He did his PhD all the way on the eastern side of the country at the University of Penn. But he came back to Utah to work here. He's been a professor for 4 years here, right? Okay, from his website, he aims at helping scientists understand complicated issues such as the environment and human cognition. Complicated systems like these require combining the approaches of multiple sciences, and philosophy can help smooth the friction this inevitably produces. And he's got some great topics of papers and presentations he's done. Written a paper or working on a paper, Mineral Misbehavior. One title is Let's Not Agree to Disagree, the Role of Strategic Disagreements in Science. Killing Cats to Save Finches, Perspective on Invasive Species and Conservation Ethics. And Philosophy of the City Against Ecological Nativism in the Urban Community. So he's just got some really mouth-watering topics here.
My mouth's kind of dry, actually. So.
Yeah, I think it's great. And today he's going to talk about who's Anthropocene. So with that, I'll hand it off to him.
Okay, you guys, I am so thrilled to be here. If 8-year-old me had known that one day he would be giving a lecture to the geology department at the U, he probably would have exploded out of pride and excitement, and there'd be bits of gore all over the front row. And to be honest, adult me doesn't feel much differently, but I'm going to try and tone it down because we have a serious topic to discuss. Here's a sad picture of a sea turtle to remind us that this is a serious topic. I want to talk about this concept, the Anthropocene, a concept that comes out of the earth sciences in the broad sense. It gets introduced into the academic literature by this piece by Crutzen and Stormer in 2000 in the Global Change newsletter. The idea behind the Anthropocene is it's this epoch where humans are this dominant geological force, and not just in any way, in the type of way that leads people to create scary graphics with like intimidating red triangles representing biodiversity loss and climate change and whatever else those red triangles represent. I can't read it from here. Now, it's not the case that you just get to like make up a word and put it in a letter and all of a sudden it's part of science. There are rules for these things. Here are some of the rules about how you introduce chronostratigraphic units, but there's nothing more interesting than nothing less interesting than bylaws, so let's move on from that slide. And I'll just note that for about 10 years, there has been an ad hoc Anthropocene working group that's been tackling the question of whether or not we should formally recognize the Anthropocene as a chronostratigraphic unit. Last year, they voted overwhelmingly in favor of making that recommendation. So the Anthropocene working group has given the Anthropocene their gold star, but this is only the beginning of the process. This is just a recommendation that they will send on to the Subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphy, which is headed by these handsome fellows. And they'll make their own recommendation to the ICS, which is headed by these handsome fellows. And they'll make their own recommendation to the International Union of Geological Sciences, which is you know what? I'll just put up a picture of mountains. You see what they look like. And that will have made the final determination. So we've made it through the first bit of the process. It only took us 20 years, and hopefully by the time we're done, the Anthropocene won't already be over. But it actually makes a lot of sense to be very methodical and deliberative in asking questions about the Anthropocene. And this is because questions about the Anthropocene are not necessarily the kinds of questions that stratigraphers are used to asking. There are lots of ways in which Anthropocene stratigraphy is weird. Among other things, we're asking a science which normally studies the past to make predictions about what the present is going to look like in the future. And that's weird. Anthropocene and anthropogenic sediments come about through new types of processes of sedimentation. They include new sedimentary materials. Questions about the Anthropocene are sort of politically charged, and that never makes doing science easier. And I assume that the reason all of you chose to study rocks is because they're a nice, well-behaved system, unlike people. But when you're talking about the Anthropocene, you're talking about people as well as the planet. Now, so we have careful methodical thinking about the Anthropocene going on in the earth sciences. Meanwhile, the concept has taken on a life of its own. It's spread like wildfire. Here's a still from a really good documentary that came out last year called Anthropocene, the Human Epoch. But it's not just in things like documentaries. The concept is all over the place in academia, from biology to the social sciences to the humanities, the arts, whatever ontopolitics is. It's a sort of thing where it's like, hey, are you a classics professor who's struggling to seem relevant in the 21st century? Try this one weird trick. Just take the guy you're talking about and tack on the words in the Anthropocene, and you'll be eating lunch at the cool kids table again very soon. And it's not just academics. Activists are very happy to point out that the Anthropocene is the trashiest of all the epochs. Even in pop culture. So for example, pop musician Grimes is about to release an album called Miss Anthropocene, and that is a lit album title, though before you give her too much credit, remember this is someone who willingly chose to have a baby with Elon Musk. Anthropocene is even a hashtag, right? It's all over Twitter or Instagram. Do you want your aerial photography to be politically relevant? Just throw on the Anthropocene hashtag. Do you want your pile of trash to become art? Just throw on the Anthropocene hashtag. Right? So the Anthropocene has really taken on a life of its own. Meanwhile, let's jump back to geology, where we're asking some careful questions. Right? And questions like the ones we've already discussed about formal recognition, but also questions just about like what is going on in geology today. What makes geology of the potential Anthropocene distinctive? How should we think about this interaction of the Earth system and human systems? Now, as an aside, I just want to note that last year I took a swing at this first question, and the one-slide version of my answer was, we probably are living in the Anthropocene, but we should wait before we officially say so. When you think about this from the perspective of the sediments that are being created right now, a lot of the things that are happening are things that could be mitigated or reversed in the near future and thus won't last into the geologic record. A lot of the stuff that's going on is stuff that's been going on ever since agriculture started, basically. And some of the things that people like to talk about are just not really globally significant. This is not most of the things that we are doing a whole bunch of globally significant things, and I don't want to deny that. Of course, some people have suggested that independent of what's going on in sedimentation, we should recognize the Anthropocene on the basis of the sort of political force of showing consensus among scientists that humans are a geological force. But I think this just is a misunderstanding of what the best science of the science communication tells us. For one thing, it turns out the public doesn't care what you think. Sorry. Second, the stupid things that people believe about the planet don't seem to be driven by a lack of access to scientific information. They're just driven by the stupidities of tribal politics. And finally, in as much as we care about designating the Anthropocene for political reasons, I think it works better as a threat than a promise. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled talk here. This is just a nice little aside. So we have these questions we want to ask, and it turns out that when you're trying to answer these questions, you have to be careful in specifying whose Anthropocene you're talking about. So for example, when the Anthropocene Working Group released their report last year, they were explicit that they were only dealing with non-geological interpretations of the Anthropocene, including those of archaeology, the social sciences, and the humanities. This is just about the geologists' Anthropocene. There's a disconnect between different people's Anthropocenes. But this fission in the concept is weird, given that what the Anthropocene is all about is the fusion of natural and human history. So it seems that this fission between the different disciplines is a problem. And of course, people start throwing punches in every direction, accusing everyone else of being the problem. Some people think that it's the geoscientists who are doing things wrong, that people like historians can't rely on our scientific colleagues. Instead, only the humanities and social sciences can do whatever it is we need to have done. There was even a letter in Nature saying that we can't trust the IUGS to make this determination, so let's make an International Anthropocene Commission that has on it people from a bunch of social sciences and paleoecology and economics and even philosophy. And it really warms my heart that they remembered us on this list. They really shouldn't have, given that there's like 1.5 total philosophy papers on this subject, and we don't deserve a seat around the table. You might also think that it's actually all these people who've got it wrong. The geoscientists know what they're talking about when they talk about the Anthropocene, and everyone else has just picked it up as a dimly defined buzzword. I don't want to like go around throwing blame about who's doing things wrong here, but it's clear that we're not all on the same page, and this sucks. Everyone thinks that we want more collaboration across the natural and social science divide, but this just hasn't happened. There is no interdisciplinary study of the Anthropocene that's really coming together in a meaningful way. And maybe one problem is differences concerning fundamental concepts, like the concept of Anthropocene itself. And this has led some people to try and do some work clarifying the concept. And most of this work is usually really bad. It's like this word cloud about what the Anthropocene means, and don't look at this, it's really bad. It'll just confuse you. So I want to see if I can do a little bit better. And I want to start by asking the question, is what we've seen with this concept, it's only a 20-year-old concept, I can't even drink yet, but maybe it's already speciated and become 3 different concepts in the different disciplines. And the question is, if this has happened, is there some sort of common ground that we could build on to sort of bring ourselves back together and actually do some productive interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work? So my question for the rest of this talk is, what are the prospects for some sort of transdisciplinary cooperation? Where is the common ground that we could build on? Now, the method I'm going to use to do this is called corpus linguistics. And a corpus is just a body of text, and corpus linguistics is just doing linguistics on a body of text. The plural of corpus is corpora, and I'm going to look at 3 corpora that I created with the help of my research assistants. A geosciences corpus, a humanities corpus, and a social sciences corpus. And so we can have work from all 3 families of discipline. The corpora are built only from articles which contain the word Anthropocene. And they all come from respectable peer-reviewed journals. They're large enough that we're going to get good data. And the corpora are sort of made so that they're equal on a bunch of important properties. Here's what the corpora look like. They're all about 1.6 million words. They draw on papers from these journals. You can ask me later if you're curious why these journals. I'm not going to peel back the curtain right now. But once we have these corpora, we can start asking questions. And just to help you sort of understand the methodology, I'm going to start by asking a not very useful question. And the not very useful question is, how often does the word Anthropocene appear in each corpus? How frequent is it? And it turns out that in geology, you say Anthropocene, and in the social sciences, they say Anthropocene, and in the humanities, we say Anthropocene, Anthropocene. And I don't know what this means, if it means anything. And at this point, we don't actually know that it means anything. This could just be some sort of artifact of our corpora. We need more statistics. This need for more statistics in corpus linguistics is called the whelk problem. Just because this is what the first guy who called attention to it called it, and he used an example that's like the example I'm about to give you. So whelks are these marine gastropods, and they build beautiful shells. And the reason which whelks build beautiful shells from themselves is to better hide the fact that they themselves are horrifying monsters. The perspicuous among you will notice that this particular horrifying monster is on a dinner plate, so I hope that they taste a lot better than they look. The problem with whelks is this. Whelk is not a very common word in the English language, in pretty much any context. But when people talk about whelks, they often talk about them a lot. Suppose in my geosciences corpus, I had a paper about whelk paleontology. When someone writes this paper, they're of course going to mention whelk in the title, and they're going to mention whelk in the abstract. And if we look in the body of the text, it's just going to be here a whelk, there a whelk, everywhere a whelk, whelk. This is going to make it look like whelk is a really common word. This is just like part of the first page. If we do the whole 20-page paper, it's going to look like whelk is a super common word in geology, right? And that's not the case. It just happens to be really common in this one paper. So we can't just look at raw frequencies. We need some sort of inferential statistic to help us here. And here's where I would like to spend the next 10 minutes geeking out about statistics in corpus linguistics and explain to you why we're not going to do p-values and stuff like that. But I prefer that my audience remain awake. So instead, I'm just going to tell you we're going to use a statistic called dispersion. In this case, our measure is going to be the coefficient of variation. And the way to read this is low numbers, numbers in the ones and twos, mean that the word is evenly spread out-ish in the corpus. And that should tell us it's not just an artifact of the particular papers in our corpus. The frequency numbers are representing a real effect. High dispersion numbers are going to tell us that the frequency numbers we're seeing might be iffier. High dispersion measures are saying this word is concentrated in just a subset of the papers in the corpus. Okay. Now that we understand frequency and dispersion, I can start to explain the useful questions we can ask of our corpora. Useful question number one is the question of keywords. And now keywords in corpus linguistics mean something very specific. You can't just say, what are the keywords of this corpus or what are the keywords of this paper? It's only a relative thing in corpus linguistics. You can ask, what are the keywords of the geoscience corpus with reference to the humanities corpus? So the keywords are going to be words which distinguish one corpus from the other. And lock words are words which are common to both corpora. Now, in our three corpora, the lock words are just going to be the types of language that's used common in all of academic writing. The lock words are not going to be informative to us for a question of common ground to build some sort of interdisciplinary cooperation. What's going to be interesting for us is the keywords. So we're going to ask what are the keywords of each of our corpora in relation to each of our other corpora. And we need a measure to do this. And there are lots of options for keyword measures. The one I'm going to run with is Kilgariff's simple maths procedure, which is a really fancy way of saying just do frequency plus a constant and then the ratio of that. The nice thing about the SMP is this constant. It's like a knob we can turn in order to make a trade-off. So the higher we turn the knob, the more of the noise in the data we screen out. Also, the higher we turn the knob, the more real but weak effects we screen out. This is just how statistics normally works. But fortunately for us, I'm not interested in weak effects anyway, so I'm going to turn the knob up really high. I'm going to add the constant of 100 here, and this is going to make it really hard for us to get noisy results. When we see results, we're going to assume that they are moderate to strong results, since we've turned the knob up really high. And then after I generate the keywords, I'm going to pull out all the stuff that's not really useful to us. So what is it going to look like? Well, I'll show you the keywords for the geoscience corpus when compared to the humanities corpus as a reference corpus. So we have here the token, the word. We have how often that appears in the corpus. The dispersion measure, so we have low dispersion. This is a real effect. And then here's Kilgariff's simple maths, 15, 16, that's like astronomically high measures of keyword strength here. So our biggest keywords here are et and al. Why is this? Well, you people in the natural scientists may not know this, but unlike you guys, in the humanities, we do not play nicely with others. We don't co-author papers. We don't cite people. Mostly we just sit hunched over our desks scribbling, occasionally looking up paranoid that we might have to interact with another human being. And what this means is we're not citing co-authored papers in humanities research, unlike you guys who are just citing co-authored papers all the time. This is a great result, not because it's informative for us for the question we're asking about the Anthropocene, but what it does do is it validates the measure we're using. This is precisely what we would want to see comparing a natural sciences versus a humanities corpus. This is coming out super clear. It seems like we're measuring real stuff. You'll notice that the next two strongest keywords, which are almost as strong, are things which are going to be very relevant to thinking about the way different disciplines are thinking about the Anthropocene. But we'll save the analysis for later. Okay, so here's a filtered list of the top 250 geosciences versus humanities keywords. I thought about just sitting here for 10 minutes while you read over it. That's still my backup plan if I start to lose my voice. But instead, I've classified them so that it can start to make a little more sense. A lot of the keywords are going to be things that are just what you would expect in the natural sciences, centimeter, plus or minus. Obviously not things you see in the humanities very often. And then there's going to be a bunch of geology stuff. Because this is an Anthropocene corpus, we're going to see climate change and paleobiology, the names of people who are cited quite a bit, that sort of thing. None of this should be surprising to you. You guys know what geoscience research looks like. You might not have as good of an idea of what humanities research looks like. If anything, you might have a like vague impression that the humanities is just a bunch of self-absorbed navel gazing, but that's a pernicious stereotype. And I'm here to tell you that it's a pernicious stereotype that's backed up by the data. This is a selected group of the stronger keywords in the, if you compare the humanities corpus to the geosciences corpus. I want to say, obviously, we don't actually just spend all of our time navel gazing. We talk about things outside of ourselves in the humanities, things like, I don't know, things. I bet we can say something more concrete. I mean, the question is still open. Like, what's the object of study in the humanities? Just things? Like, what specific kind of beings do humanists study? Okay, joke slides over. Back to the boring list. I want to actually, the humanities keywords are actually really informative. Not everything they're informative about is stuff that's relevant to our question. Turns out humanists are really interested in showing how not sexist they are. Keywords number 2 and 4 there. But when we classify the humanities keywords, we see some really interesting things that when humanists are talking about the Anthropocene, they're talking about things from the perspective of human experience. We have particular ways of talking about nature, and some of the names that we're citing are important. We're going to come back to Donna Haraway and Bruno Latour and why they're important. These other names, not so much. Why David, Paul, and Robert? Well, that's just because in the humanities, there are a lot of middle-aged white men. Come back in 30 years and those names will be, I don't know, Jaden and Josh and whatever. Okay, I have no joke slides about the social sciences. It didn't seem like it'd be fair to make fun of them behind their backs. So here are the social sciences keywords compared to the geoscience corpus. Here they are classified, and I'm not going to dwell on this slide for too long, just to note that the sort of dominant category here is things related to value, things, power and justice and ethics and morality and stuff like that. That when social scientists are talking about the Anthropocene, this is the kind of thing they're talking about, and that's interesting. Come back to that. Okay, those are the keywords. I'm going to give you my analysis of them in a little bit, but we want to get one more piece of information on the table. In addition to keywords, we can look at collocates. And collocates, unsurprisingly, are words that are co-located with other words. And so we're interested not just in what people are saying in papers that mention the Anthropocene, but like what people are saying in the immediate linguistic context of the term Anthropocene. So we're going to look 7 words previous. Seven, that's not a 7, that's a 5. Okay. Maybe we'll have to just have you stare at a slide for a minute while I recover. But anyway, we're going to look 5 words before and 5 words after the word Anthropocene, and we're going to normalize things because we don't want like the word "the" to just be the dominant collocate here. Obviously, it would be, but that's not interesting. And we're not going to pay attention to any collocates which are co-located with Anthropocene less than 15 times because that's probably just noise. Here's how I'm going to present the collocate information to you. This is not just a meaningless word cloud. There's a lot of information being conveyed in this. The first thing I want you to pay attention to is the color of the circle. The darker the gray of the circle is, the more frequently the word appears with Anthropocene. So history appears with Anthropocene a moderate amount. Anthropology appears with Anthropocene a lot. The second thing I want to pay attention to is the distance between Anthropocene and the other node. So a short distance says that these are stronger collocates. What that means is not only do Anthropocene and epoch appear together a lot, but epoch does not appear elsewhere in the corpus very much. That strong collocates means that when they appear, they tend to appear with each other. So while Earth and Anthropocene appear in close proximity almost as much as Anthropocene and epoch do, Earth appears elsewhere in the corpus all over the place, so there's a longer line. The final piece of data here that's interesting is position on the x-axis. And that tells you the average position in relation to Anthropocene of the thing. So epoch appears on average probably something like 1.1 or 1.2 words after Anthropocene, which makes sense. People are saying Anthropocene epoch. But people are saying Anthropocene blah, 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 nature. because it's further along on the x-axis. Okay, so a lot of information being conveyed here. Here's what the social sciences look like. Here's what the geosciences look like. I'm going to come back to this. I'm just going to note one thing here in passing, which is that you guys recognize that the Anthropocene brings up a bunch of philosophical questions. That's awesome. I wish my philosophical colleagues agreed. And here's the humanities. This is really hard to read because there's a lot more diversity in how humanists are talking about the Anthropocene. There's just a lot more words that they're using around the word Anthropocene, and so this comes across as really messy, but we're still going to be able to pull out a lot of interesting data from this. Okay, so on to the interpretation of the data. As I head into this, I want to note that while corpus linguistics is big data science, it's not black box big data science. You can and should look inside the box. Here's me looking inside the box of the Humanities Anthropocene corpus. I'm looking at the Anthropocene and the actual context of it. I can do this just by like right-clicking on something while I'm working with the data. And when you're interpreting your data in corpus linguistics, you have to add this layer of interpretation. It's not just the computer tells you, here are some numbers and here's what these numbers mean. You have to figure out what those numbers mean, and that means that, like this sculpture about the Anthropocene, corpus linguistics is an art as well as a science. Now, the interpretations I'm going to make of the data I just presented to you, you might just say, duh, that's obvious. But look, loudly stating the obvious is what makes me a philosopher. And loudly stating the obvious backed up by data makes me a cutting-edge philosopher. So here's the first obvious thing that I think the data tells us. In the geosciences, the Anthropocene is a question, whereas in the social sciences and humanities, it's something more like an answer, and I'll explain what I mean on that in a second. But here's where we're seeing this in the geosciences. When you look at the words that are co-located with Anthropocene, we're seeing you're asking questions about defining the Anthropocene. You're asking what sort of unit the Anthropocene is, and you're asking when its onset is and when it started. You have an Anthropocene working group that is asking questions about formally designating the Anthropocene by looking for a geological marker of it. The collocates of Anthropocene in the geosciences corpus are question collocates. This is not the case in the other two corpora. In the other two corpora, it seems like what's going on is they stumbled upon this concept from geology, and it looked like a really nice cudgel that they could pick up and use to beat their enemies with. And that there is the Anthropocene, that geologists have already figured it out, is taken as a settled issue, and the real question is, what are we going to do about the Anthropocene? Then how are we going to understand it? As you can guess, this is already going to cause a lot of problems, just trying to do some sort of interdisciplinary work on this. But this is not to say that the Anthropocene is not controversial in the humanities. The Anthropocene is controversial, it's just controversial in a very different way than the way it's controversial in the geosciences. The controversy is not if the Anthropocene or what is the Anthropocene like. The controversy is whether Anthropocene is the right name for it. So if you look, some of the strongest collocates for Anthropocene in the corpus are Capitalocene, Plantationocene, and Cthulhucene. The idea here is Anthropocene blames all of humanity, but we don't want a name that blames all of humanity. We just want to blame the subset of capitalists or plantation owners or otherworldly eldritch monsters that are actually causing the global environmental crisis. And so it's almost to the point where you can't mention the Anthropocene without mentioning that it's a bad name in the humanities. You have to, the scholar most associated with raising this issue is Donna Haraway. And you'll notice that by the darkness of the circle, she gets talked about in the context of the Anthropocene even more than the guy who invented the word. That uninventing the word is a little more important here. Now, obviously, in the geosciences, you're not talking about the Cthulhucene, the Anthropocene versus, let's go back, the Holocene, right? Okay. You might think, okay, there's some stuff about humanities and geosciences. Let's look at geosciences and social sciences. They're both really interested in ongoing global change. And that's true. But we were talking about different things that are changing. Unsurprisingly, geologists are talking about sedimentation and hydrology and atmospheric stuff. And unsurprisingly, social scientists are talking about politics and stuff. But what's weird to me is that the social scientists aren't also talking, at the very least, about things like CO2 and temperature. Right? You would expect that those are really important to the social sciences, but it turns out that these are fairly strong keywords for the geosciences versus the social sciences. The social sciences seem to be content saying stuff is changing. Now let's go back to talking about politics rather than thinking about the particular ramifications of things like hydrology or CO2 emissions for politics and vice versa. Now, shared sort of conceptual territory isn't the only sort of common ground we might find. We can also find common ground through co-citation. And to a certain extent, we see a little bit of this, right? So everyone in all three corpora are citing the original inventors and proponents of the term Anthropocene, right? Here's the geosciences, social sciences, and humanities. But that's about it. And this is a very weak sort of co-citation because they're just like pointing, yeah, those guys made a word. I'm going to use that word now. And there's no real content coming along with that. The other people we see popping up as being cited frequently in different literatures are totally distinct. So in geology, you cite Rudiman, who is the proponent of an early onset for the Anthropocene, like 8,000 years ago, Jan Zalasiewicz, the head of the Anthropocene Working Group, and these people are not popping up in the other corpora. We've already seen that it's Donna Haraway, who the humanists are talking about, and also Bruno Latour. And I'm giving you the not just the colloquy data, but the keyword data here to point out how stark this is. Latour is being cited all over the place in the humanities corpus and never in the geosciences corpus. He's like central in the humanities study of the Anthropocene and irrelevant to the geosciences. And this is despite the fact that actually Zalasiewicz and Latour have worked together on Anthropocene stuff. But this sort of one-off collaboration hasn't built any sort of bridges between the disciplines. I think what we're seeing from the data here is not a whole lot of common ground. We're just seeing a whole bunch of gaps, even in places where we might expect to see commonality. Right? You would hope that geologists who are interested in the processes that are changing the Earth would be asking questions about, say, the political and economic processes that are changing the Earth, or that social scientists who are interested in the Earth-changing effects of those politics and economics would start asking questions about, like, you know, this economic system versus this economic system, what's the effect it's going to have on the hydrology of this area? But that's not really happening. You see people raising the issue that there is this connection and then quickly falling back into their own discipline. Even in places where people seem like they might start talking about the same thing, it doesn't quite happen. So both geologists and humanists are really interested in space and time, but with totally different vocabularies for discussing it. And it seems like the sort of objective way of thinking about space and time and the sort of subjective way of thinking about it, maybe there's not really a real connection there. Everyone is interested in the impact of the Anthropocene and the impact of global change, but of course it's impact in the terms of things like carbon and erosion and temperature in geology, whereas in the social sciences and humanities, it's worries about economic disaster and the global environmental crisis. Okay. So there's just a quick pass at the data, and I'm sure there's a lot more we could pull out of this, but it's been a busy week. So, I'm going to sort of try and sum up what's going on here. I'm going to try and piss everyone off equally. I'm going to start from the assumption that we are serious when we say we want to have interdisciplinary collaboration on this. And then I'm going to say why I think it's not happening given the data we've just looked at and what might need to change a little bit. That's not the only perspective we could take on this, but let's start from that perspective and then maybe take a step back. So what's going on in geology that's making it hard to work with the social sciences? Well, totally understandably, geologists are, even when discussing the Anthropocene, are trying to remain apolitical and do this sort of ideal, objective, value-free science. And that's great. That's a good thing to be trying to do as a scientist. But it raises two problems here in trying to work with social sciences. First of all, the Anthropocene is about a time period when politics affects geology. And if you just stay as far away from politics as you can't even talk about the geology stuff that's happening. And if there could be a little bit of movement there, that might start to build a bridge to the social sciences. The other issue is, for the social sciences, they seem very comfortable with their science just being expressly political. And while that probably is inappropriate in the natural sciences, there might be ways that natural scientists could do things, not letting their politics bias their science, but being explicit about the ways in which political issues motivate their science, or the political impacts of their science, in that those might be ways to build bridges to the social sciences. My research assistants, who I'll highlight in a minute, they gave me this interpretation of what's going on with the social science side of it. We sat down together, and this was their hot take. And I think they're right. In the social science surrounding the Anthropocene, it's more about advocacy than actually understanding what's going on in the Anthropocene. Again, the Anthropocene is for them more of an answer than a question. So we already have the answer. Bad stuff is happening, and then the question is, what do we do about it? But this, of course, is very much not the right sort of question for them to be asking if they want to sit down with geoscientists and make progress. They should be asking questions like the questions I mentioned earlier. How does this political policy or this economic structure end up affecting geological processes? And that's something which social scientists could help with, but they don't seem to be asking that question very much, even when they're talking about what is ostensibly a geological concept. So there's some ground that they could give. My read of the humanities is a little bit different in that, unlike the social sciences, they actually are trying to understand what's going on in the Anthropocene, at least from a human perspective. And the problem here, I think, is that the traditional methods of the humanities only get you so far. You can learn a little bit about how humans and the Earth relate to each other and impact each other by critiquing literature, but not a whole lot. The types of questions which humanists are trying to answer using the traditional methods are actually the types of questions which social scientific methods are going to be better at answering. And that sort of conservatism about methodology in the humanities, I think, is like a border wall here, keeping them from joining the table and being part of this interdisciplinary work. And I guess we need to tear down that wall if we want to see cooperation. So, to answer our question, have we seen rapid speciation? I think the answer is clearly yes. We don't see a whole lot of common ground. We just see a bunch of gaps. And you might take this to be a pretty desolate conclusion. But we could make a few different moves having come to this conclusion. We could say, well, maybe the Anthropocene is just like a non-concept. It really is just, it was a good idea, it did some work when we first proposed it, but it really has just become this messy, dimly defined buzzword, and we should just throw it on a scrap heap with all the other crappy buzzwords. That's a possibility that I think we should seriously consider, given the sort of non-cohesiveness of the way people are talking about this concept. But another possibility is to say, look, the Anthropocene just is 3 species now, or at least 3 species, but it's doing good work in different ways for the different kinds of questions different disciplines are asking, and that's fine. Just be clear about whose Anthropocene you're talking about, and we'll keep all these concepts, and what should be thrown on the trash heap is just the dream of interdisciplinary collaboration. Suppose you want to keep the dream alive. I kind of do, right? Here I am a humanities scholar presenting social scientific data to a natural sciences audience. I better be someone who wants to keep the dream alive. Then I think the only option is to say, if you really are serious about wanting to bring everyone around the table and doing work together, then everyone needs to be willing to give quite a bit. That we're asking hard things of all the disciplines. We're asking social scientists to ask different questions. We're asking people in the humanities to adopt different methods. We're asking natural scientists to do things that seem uncomfortable from the perspective of natural science. But the fact of the matter is, if we are living in the Anthropocene, one thing the Anthropocene asks of all life is that it radically adapt. And scientists are alive, I think. So that's my conclusion. There isn't common ground, but that doesn't mean that it's not, at least theoretically, impossible for us to build it. I want to close by giving thanks to my research assistants, who are sitting kind of in the back over there, pretending not to know me, but here are their pictures, so that's not going to work too well. want to thank the Environmental Humanities Graduate Program, who bought me out of teaching for a couple semesters so that I could try and make the philosophy of Anthropocene science a thing, even though it's not really a thing. And the Digital Matters over at the library, who, when I went to them and told them I needed money to do this research, they gave me money to do this research, even though I'd already done most of this research before I'd got the money. Okay, I mean, one of the reasons I'm so excited to be here is because I need your help making sense of the data I have here and know whether what I'm saying makes any sense. So we've got a good amount of time for questions and comments. Have at me.